times in a free state of our own. That's the vision. That's the dream. And we are building it in New Hampshire. I'm Eric Brakey, your host and renegade statesman for the Porcupine Report. Welcome to your source for porcupine news and free-range conversation on matters of liberty. All right, let's hop into the show. Hey there, everyone. Eric Brakey here, your host and renegade statesman. Thank you so much for joining us today on episode 8 of the Porcupine Report. You know, I'm not really into numerology, but 8 is my lucky number. So this is going to be a great episode. Fun fact about me, I was born on 8/8/88, August 8th, 1988. Bet you didn't care to even know about me, but that's why I'm excited for episode 8 today. We have a great guest, a good friend of mine. I'll be introducing him in a little bit. But first, I want to do our first promo of the episode. The Porcupine Freedom Festival. I bet you were expecting me, like I've done in all the last episodes, to come right out the gate and tell you about purchasing tickets to the New Hampshire Liberty Forum. I'm sorry, it's finally too late for you to get tickets for the New Hampshire Liberty Forum because it's done. It's over. It was excellent. It was great. We're going to be talking about it in a little bit. But don't worry, because you have not yet missed out on our other upcoming wonderful Liberty event with the Free State Project. That is the Porcupine Freedom Festival, popularly known by its shorthand as PorcFest. That is going to be June 17th to the 23rd at Rogers Campground in Lancaster, New Hampshire. Beautiful. It's a beautiful area. If you've never been there, boy, the mountains are something to behold. You're going to want to come and join us, not just for the mountains, but for so many other reasons. This is a family-friendly freedom festival. Ron Paul will be speaking to us virtually. He'll be zooming in, but so many other folks will be zooming in physically. They'll be getting in their cars and zooming over to go camping with 2,000 of their favorite libertarians, including Scott Horton, Gene Epstein, Jeffrey Tucker, James Bovard, David Friedman, and so many more. Maybe even our guest who's on the show this today, because at Liberty Forum, I was telling him this is his first Liberty Forum, and he's never been to PorcFest either. So, you know, I was selling him on it. He seems like maybe he might join us at PorcFest. I hope that he will. So this event, PorcFest, it's not to be missed. If you've never been there, you have been missing out, and there's no reason to miss out any more than you already have. So bring your friends, bring your family, and reserve your campsite while supplies last. Go grab your tickets at porcfest.com. That's pork with a C, not with a K. Kind of like how Eric is spelled with a C, not with a K. Pork with a C, not a K. If you go to porcfestwithak.com, I have no idea what you're going to find. Best case scenario, you find some delicious barbecue, but you're not going to find the family-friendly freedom festival you're looking for. So go to porcfestwithak.com and grab your tickets before they sell out, because this event does sell out. All right, let's hop into the rest of the show, everyone. So as I mentioned, we just had the New Hampshire Liberty Forum, and our guest today joined us. This was his first New Hampshire Liberty Forum. He came to introduce our friend Glenn Jacobs, the mayor of Knox County, Tennessee, who we had as a guest on this show, and he gave a great keynote address Saturday night. But I invited our guest today to introduce him. One, we just wanted an excuse to invite him out. We all love this guy, and we were glad to be able to reconnect. His name is Jack Hunter. Jack is someone who has been in the liberty movement longer than I have been. In fact, I think I sometimes embarrass him a little bit, because I used to be I'm still a big fan of his, but you know, eventually you become friends with people, and at that point, I guess you stop calling yourself a fan. But Jack was a big part of why I'm a libertarian today. I believe it or not, I know it's painful to admit, once upon a time, I was a neoconservative. This was a long time ago. I was a young man. I was in like high school, college. I was young and naive. I believed everything Fox News told me, and the Bush administration and the wars and all of that. And there was this guy, Jack Hunter, and he was making YouTube videos, and he was so skilled at communicating to conservatives, speaking to our conservative principles on why, if you are a conservative and you have these conservative principles, how if you actually are interested in being consistent and really following through with them, you actually believe in liberty. You are a libertarian. I remember Jack Hunter saying in one of his videos, there's the Federal Department of Education, right? We all hate it. It's terrible. It's a giant government bureaucracy. It takes our money and it wastes it, and it doesn't make education better for kids. It makes education outcomes worse. We all recognize this. So where's the magical fairy dust we sprinkle over the Department of Defense to make it anything different than another government bureaucracy? Boy, the light bulb went off over my head, and suddenly I was a libertarian. So I want to welcome to the show my good friend, Jack Hunter.
Sorry about that. I was letting the dog in.
So it's all right. I know at the pre-show the dog was running around back. So
yeah,
we love dogs on this show. So you take care of your dog, Jack. Thanks
so
much.
At an opportune time, she decided that she needed to do all that. So how's everybody doing? I'm back.
Doing all right.
That was a nice introduction, Eric. I heard every bit of it. That's very kind.
Oh, well, I was hoping maybe I saved you the embarrassment of that if you were out taking care of the dog. Well, Jack, it's great to have you on the show. You just got back from your first ever Liberty Forum. I know that you were kind of there for a day and you caught like the tail end of it, but how did you like it? How was your experience at the New Hampshire Liberty Forum in Nashua, New Hampshire?
I thought it was fantastic. I'm embarrassed I had not gone before. There's so many wonderful liberty organizations, and the Free State Project predates by a good bit the Ron Paul movement. Not him and his, being in Congress and whatnot, but what was it, 2000 or 2001, the Free State Project began?
Yeah, and the Ron Paul revolution was like we had a great conversation with the founder on the show a few episodes back, and it got some early momentum, and then it was limping along for a while until the Ron Paul revolution was like the infusion of energy that really kind of helped take the Free State Project to the next level. And certainly so many libertarians wouldn't be libertarians today if it wasn't for Dr. Paul and his campaigns.
Absolutely. And talk about being in the right place at the right time. This wonderful organization that now you're a part of. And like I said, predated Ron Paul. And, Ron Paul is more responsible than any other libertarian in the United States for elevating the ideas and principles we believe in. I used to give speeches to young Americans for liberty, especially between around 2010, 2011, 2012, that if you look at Ayn Rand's book sales, they did pretty well when they came out, but the highest amount they've ever sold were when he was running for president, Ron Paul. Like, you just look across the board, and he did more to popularize. Some people knew what libertarians were. Some people thought we were weirdos. A lot of us are weirdos, and that's okay. To each their own. We're all individualists. But him and his legacy, people like his son, Senator Rand Paul, Thomas Massey, Justin Amash, let's hope he wins. Things going on in the Libertarian Party, wonderful organizations like the Free State Project, who, like you said, we said predated, but boy, it was certainly helped when Ron Paul came along. All that matters, and it continues to matter. And we'll talk about this more today. But I think sometimes people get down. They see the world around us. They see the politics around us and think, what did we do? Was it all for naught? No, we've actually had a lot of influence. And I would like to say that the older you are, the more you can see it. The younger you are, sometimes you don't have anything to compare it to that was actually worse.
In the past, Jack, I think a framing of things that's always given me hope is something that you've talked about in the past. You've often compared the Ron Paul revolution to the Goldwater revolution, and I've always taken this to heart. Right after the Goldwater revolution led to the Reagan revolution, but there was a gap of like 16 years, right? It would be very easy after Barry Goldwater lost his race for president to think, we lost. This has all been a waste. let's go like gnash our teeth and let's give up. All hope is lost. But the Barry Goldwater campaign planted seeds that took a long time to come to maturity, particularly because he activated the youth, the young people. He got young people excited. And, young people have a lot of energy, but what they do not have is money and like institutional support. Right. And so you can only get so far on enthusiasm alone. But eventually, over time, those young people get older, they become wealthier, they get more involved in politics, and they go on to become parts of the institutions that set the trajectory. And so it was a long burn, but eventually those seeds were planted in that young generation, and that led to Ronald Reagan. Now, I think there's something very similar that has happened with kind of the Ron Paul revolution, right? He spoke to the young people, planted those seeds, and I don't know exactly how it's going to manifest. Is there going to be a Liberty president because of what Ron Paul did in 2008 and 2012? Who knows? Maybe, but there is Young Americans for Liberty. There is the Free State Project. There are hundreds of Liberty legislators elected to state capitals across this country, and it all comes back to Ron Paul. I mean, Bitcoin is challenging the Federal Reserve and its early adopters and proponents. It's become a worldwide phenomenon. But in the early days, it was the Ron Paul supporters. It was the Libertarians, and particularly in the state of New Hampshire, that nurtured it and brought it to, got it through its early infancy of becoming something.
No, I think that's right. And the Goldwater comparison is apt. So, Barry Goldwater's running for president in 1964. Of course, he got his butt kicked. But it was a youth movement. The young conservatives at that time, or people who didn't even know they were political, but were late teenagers, early 20s. That was the force behind the old Goldwater movement. That was the first experience with politics. And for them, it was all about the ideas. Judge Andrew Napolitano is called Barry Goldwater the godfather of American libertarianism. He dedicated one of his books to him in that way. But yeah, he lost electorally. But what happened with his movement is they institutionalized. A lot of those young people became older. They had businesses. Some remained in politics. Some did both. Of course, Ronald Reagan introduced Barry Goldwater on network television as a young actor at the time, or youngish actor at the time, and would go on to be president in 1980. That was a direct result of what Goldwater accomplished something in 1964, was getting Ronald Reagan elected in 1980. And then, after that or around that, you had the Heritage Foundation and just a strong conservative movement. I shouldn't even say it that way. A conservative movement that had not been there prior. You had obviously conservative writers and H.L. Mencken and different things before that, but there was no institutionalized firm movement the way it was. National Review was a part of that. And that all started with Goldwater. What I've seen with the Ron Paul movement is somebody who's been there since day one. Actually, let me compare it to another movement real quick. I was a Pat Buchanan kid. When I was 19 or 20, that was my guy. And I wasn't socially conservative big time anything, but I was definitely anti-war, and I was on the right. And that's what was happening. He spoke out against America's foreign policy. A lot of people might not know that Pat Buchanan endorsed Ron Paul for his congressional run in 1996. And the Tea Party goes to Washington. Rand Paul talks about, or Kelly Paul, she's in that book somewhat. The first political event she ever attended was a Pat Buchanan event with her soon-to-be husband, Rand Paul. So he's part of this story too. After Pat Buchanan won in 1996, the New Hampshire primary, it was a big deal. He was on the cover of Time and Newsweek, and people were talking about this anti-war conservative populist movement. It was a big deal. It was a big deal to me as a kid. After that happened, nothing was followed up. They didn't institutionalize. There was no Young Americans for Pat Buchanan, like Young Americans for Liberty used to be students for Ron Paul. There was nothing like that. You were just kind of there in the moment. If you liked it, you liked it. It happened. It was fun. It was memorable. And then that was it. With the Ron Paul movement, not only do you have great groups like the Free State Project that plugged into the Ron Paul movement for all the right reasons and all the obvious reasons, but a group like Young Americans for Liberty, I've spoken at every one of their events since 2009, and every year it's bigger. And as it grows, I know fewer and fewer people, and I absolutely love it because that means you have a movement that's growing. If I went every year, it was the same amount of people, and they weren't really young Americans for Liberty anymore, maybe like middle-aged or whatever they were, and it was
I've
diminishing.
gotten to that point myself. I think I hit 35. I'm now, I guess I'm more comfortable going to the Free State Project because they accept us middle-aged Americans for liberty.
Sure. But if I kept going and it was diminishing, it was less people, there was no young people. That's not a healthy movement, but it's the opposite of that. And Ron Paul still speaks there every year. I think, people, let's contrast about where we are. When Rand Paul ran for Senate in 2010, he had to go on the Rachel Maddow show to make a national announcement about that. Now, people of a certain age are probably like, what in the hell are you talking about? No conservative host wanted, this is after the 2008 cycle when Ron Paul ran, and everybody from Rush Limbaugh to Sean Hannity to Bill O'Reilly, they were all like, Ron Paul's a liberal. He's not for the war. He's against Bush. He's against torture. He's against the Patriot Act. He's actually serious about limited government spending. They didn't phrase it that way, but that's what they were saying. He's a liberal. Real conservatives are John McCain and Mitt Romney, Fred Thompson for the 08 cycle, Mike Huckabee. These are real conservatives. This libertarian goof over here. No. So when Rand Paul decided he was going to run for Senate, he had to go on the liberal MSNBC show because they at least liked the Ron Paul movement on civil liberties and whatnot at the time. That's where we were. We weren't in a conservative movement where there was a Tea Party and you had Mike Lee and Rand Paul and Thomas Massie out there and conservatives like them and said, yeah, these guys are right. We don't like these Bush type guys, these John McCain and Mitt Romney. We like Rand Paul. Like that's the conservative environment that we're in now, right? It wasn't always like that. Ron Paul, intentionally or not, was the beginning of that changing. Yeah. Now, obviously, Donald Trump was a big part of that, but Rand Paul and Thomas Massie were on Fox News a whole hell of a lot before he even came onto the scene. But you see what I'm saying? It's a very different Republican Party. It's a very different American right. And you can pinpoint the Ron Paul movement of 2008 as being the beginning of that. Because remember, even the Tea Party, which was more libertarian friendly than the Bush stuff that preceded it, didn't really still get going until late 2009, 2010. I remember there was a CNN poll, I believe, or Politico, it doesn't matter. It's a mainstream outlet did a poll. Who's the face of the Tea Party? And it was split about 50-50 between Sarah Palin and Ron Paul. So, and that was a big mass conservative movement that, all the major hosts lapped up. We were sort of in a pre-podcast era then, or it wasn't what it is now. But bring us all the way to 2024, and you're still seeing people talk about foreign policy on the right in ways that I would have never guessed when I was 19. Certainly not pre-Ron Paul. I was in talk radio. Part of the reason anybody knows who I am, I was in talk radio in Charleston, South Carolina, which is a medium to small radio market. When Ron ran for president in 2008. Like I said earlier, every conservative host across the country was like, this liberal guy, he's against the war, he sucks. But there were three guys of any kind of platform that liked Ron Paul. It was me and my small platform in Charleston. It was Judge Napolitano on his much bigger platform with Fox News. And it was Charles Goyette out in Arizona, who was a radio host who eventually got fired for being against the Iraq War. But we were the three Ron Paul guys. So I'm making all these YouTubes for my radio commentary saying Ron Paul's the guy. Here's why he's a conservative. And these guys are neocon garbage, right? And, explaining why. Those videos blew up because we were the only game in town as far as people doing that were professionals, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
At that time, people would call into the radio and say, Jack, I know you say you're a conservative, but you're not. You said that the Patriot Act was bad. The Patriot Act is good. Bush was for that. Dick Cheney's for that. That's the most conservative guy out there. You don't see people talking like that. I'm talking about your average Republican voter. They would far more look at Ron Paul now and be like, I trust this guy more than I do Mitt Romney or Liz Cheney. That's where we're at. A lot of this has to do with Trump impeachment. I'm not dumb. There's a lot of that too. But just our movement being there and capitalizing on some of that stuff too, we institutionalize. It mattered then. It mattered 5 years ago. It's mattering right now. I think it'll matter 10 years from now and beyond.
I think that for particularly a lot of younger folks, they don't quite appreciate and understand just how much of a grip the neoconservatives had over the Republican Party in the days of George W. Bush, where support for the war in Iraq and support for the Patriot Act was as much a litmus test for your conservatism as being pro-life or pro-Second Amendment. We consider those things to be the litmus tests for conservatism today. That has broken down. And certainly there's still conservatives who I run into who will still defend these wars and still take a pro-war posture. But it is not. It doesn't occupy the definition of conservatism the way that it was, where if you could be a critic of I mean, look at conservatives largely. I mean, there's still neoconservatives trying to hold on to things, but conservatives are the sector of the political spectrum that is the most questioning and the most critical of the war in Ukraine. And this brings us to an issue that I wanted to bring up and show. At the New Hampshire Liberty Forum, we had many great guests. We were glad to have you introduce our friend Glenn Jacobs. By the way, I should have mentioned that you were the co-author of Glenn Jacobs' book, and you were also a co-author of Rand Paul's book, The Tea Party Goes to Washington. You've done a lot of very impressive things with kind of your and you work with Brad Palumbo and Hannah Cox on Base Politics, which people should check out. So anyway, I want to throw those plugs in for you. But we had Tulsi Gabbard, former 4-term congresswoman from Hawaii, who is I think lieutenant colonel with the U.S. Army Reserves, formerly of the Hawaii National Guard, and she's being speculated potentially as a vice presidential candidate for Donald Trump. She's on the short list, which is very intriguing because she was a Democrat just a few short years ago. But she, in the Democratic primary debates in 2020, I think she really made a name for herself on the matter of war, basically taking the position on war that the Democrats had back in the Bush era, but she was drummed out of her party because, as the neoconservatives have found, not very kind of fertile ground anymore in the Republican Party for their hyper interventionism. They've gravitated over the Democratic Party and seem to have kind of co-opted things over there and found very much common cause with the Hillary Clinton neoliberals who seem to be running the show over there. And so she spoke at the New Hampshire Liberty Forum, and she was asked a question about policy that folks who regularly watch this show will know about: Defend the Guard, which is a legislative policy that's being pushed in state legislatures across the country, including in New Hampshire, where it's passed the New Hampshire House of Representatives, for states to exercise authority over their state National Guards to call National Guardsmen home from wars that haven't been declared by Congress. Now, I've got the clip here. I'd like if we could play it for everyone, and then I'd love to get your reaction, Jack.
Okay.
I think that the power of this legislation is it serves as a forcing function for Congress to do its job, really. That's really what it comes down to. The fact that Congress has abdicated its responsibility in being held to account and on the record for actually having to cast a vote to declare war, to authorize the use of military force. There's a reason why they have ceded essentially all of that power to the executive, is because they don't want to be on the record. They don't want to have to live with, as we saw with the Iraq War, that vote haunting them when they're on the wrong side. It's maddening to me because they're so quick to call for war, call for economic warfare through sanctions, call for a proxy war where they say, oh, don't worry, we won't have any American boots on the ground. We'll just get other people to go and give them our guns and pay for their salaries to go wage a war on our behalf, as though that's somehow a good thing. They are refusing to take responsibility for putting people's lives in harm's way. When I was deployed, I've been deployed 3 times to 3 different areas, but I remember doing my first deployment to Iraq. There were a few politicians that came through, and they generally come and they land, and they'll stay maybe for 24 hours, maybe a day and a half, shake some hands, take some pictures, and then run back to Washington and say, "Oh, I just came back from the war." And I at that time, I had left the state house in Hawaii and I volunteered to deploy to Iraq. And my company commander, I served in a medical unit, and I remember we had one of those politicians come from Hawaii out to see the Hawaii troops. And my commander came to me and he's like, excited. He's like, "Oh, you can take some time off if you want. You can go and see this member of Congress." And I just looked at him and I said, "Sir, no, thank you." I have better use of my time. When you've lived through and seen the human cost of war firsthand, when you've experienced firsthand the war profiteering that occurs, we had KBR Halliburton stamps on everything in our camp, everything. It literally makes me feel sick to my stomach to see politicians who don't honor the sacrifices that are made, both by those who pay the ultimate price, as well as those who come home potentially with both visible and invisible wounds. They don't care for the families who bear that cost of war. They take the cost and consequences so lightly. This legislation would be a way to force them to do their job. I think getting more people who understand firsthand, and the numbers are becoming less and less now than they were during the post 9/11 20 years of a high level of deployments, but getting those who have been and are impacted directly by this to go and help advocate for it state by state will absolutely have an impact.
Can you speak to maybe some of the troops as far as their feelings on the legislation? Like,
I don't think most people know about it.
Really?
Yes. And I spent 17 years in the National Guard, moved over to the Army Reserve in, I think it was 2020 or 2021. But I don't think most people know about it. And quite frankly, if they do, it's not immediately apparent to them why it's important, because this norm has been put in place. And for the National Guard, they may say, and I won't speak for them, but they may say something like, "Well, if our country needs us, we have to go." Because it is about fulfilling your responsibility and fulfilling your duty.
Right.
So Congress has not done their job for so long. It's kind of a foreign concept to say, "Oh, well, they actually have to declare war first." We laugh, but it's true. And I would say most Americans don't really, they may have heard it, but I would assume that most probably haven't. Right. And so there's some education, I think, that needs to occur there, which can lead to and should lead to accountability.
So that was Tulsi Gabbard speaking about Defend the Guard at the New Hampshire Liberty Forum. Jack, listening to that, and I think this is your first time hearing that, because I know that you were there that day, but I think later in the day. So hearing that for the first time from Tulsi Gabbard, I suppose, what are some of your takeaways there?
Well, first thing first, she mentioned the politicians that go abroad and say, "Hey, we went to the war," when they don't really see much of anything, and they come back and say everything's going swimmingly. I live in the home state of Lindsey Graham, who's a big hawk, as most of your viewers and listeners know. I remember in 2008 and probably 2012 as well, I would get these mailers at where I was living at the time, political campaign mailers. And it was Lindsey Graham in like a helicopter or a plane cockpit with like a helmet on and fatigues with camouflage and all this stuff. And he's, he was Army JAG or whatever, but like he's acting like he's Rambo over there and was really doing something and asking for money and, appealing to Republicans who still at that time thought just, mindless, endless war was a top conservative thing. And one more thing about that, and you mentioned this earlier, Eric, about back then being pro-war taking precedent over being pro-life or pro-Second Amendment. in 2008, when Ron blew up, Rudy Giuliani was a lot of conservatives' first pick to be the presidential nominee. Rudy Giuliani, who was Mr. 9/11 and War on Terror and all that kind of stuff, they would ignore that he was pro-choice. They would ignore that he passed all kinds of gun laws in New York. But he was pro-war, and that's what mattered most. And that's what matters about what Tulsi Gabbard is saying, that the states, individual states, are defending the National Guard from the federal government, putting them in wars that they don't need to be in. And we don't have these discussions because Americans have become so accustomed, as she said, that this is just the way it is. Most Americans don't think about the fact that Congress should declare war first constitutionally. The president is the executive in chief who directs them, but they don't happen without Congress's approval, which hasn't happened since World War II. The damage that war does to people, like she said, both on the inside and outside, is something you can never get back. And you look at why that happened or lives were lost, and you ask, was it worth it? The American lives, forget about the civilian deaths for a second, which are just as tragic, but the American lives lost in Iraq, what did we get out of that? What are we going to get out of any of these future ventures that people like Dan Crenshaw and Joe Biden, there's the uniparty there, are so eager to get us into? So I think it's admirable that states are passing things like defending the Guard, because the soldiers themselves and the Guard or anyone else don't get to make those decisions. It's a soldier's job to do his or her duty. It's the politicians and the leaders who put them in places that sometimes or often or more often than not, they should have never been in the first place. So if that's one way the states can combat the war machine and Congress's inability to declare war and do its job, I think it's wonderful. And it's really encouraging to see these things pass.
You know, that's such an important point. You know, if you put yourself in the shoes of a young man, maybe 21 years old, fresh young guy in the U.S. Armed Services or in a state National Guard, and is being told that you're being sent off to Syria, right? Country where we've never declared war. Under the Constitution, there's no authorization for taking the National Guard off to foment insurrection and to invade a foreign country without any law of the Union being enforced over there. But your job and your position is to take orders, right? You are not in a position to question orders.
Right.
You're in a position to say, sir, yes, sir, and to go over. And so it is the responsibility of the citizenry and the people that we elect to ensure that those orders that are being given are both properly authorized and also for a cause that is, worthwhile, is worthy of the sacrifice that's being asked. Instead, it just seems like we just have, right? It's like the self-licking ice cream cone. It's just the cause is the profits of war profiteers.
Right. When I would criticize the Iraq war in the past, people would say, conservatives would say, well, you're disrespecting the troops. I would say, no, you're disrespecting the troops. I think them putting their lives on the line is one of the greatest things anybody can do for their country. There better be a good damn reason for it. People should be asking questions of their government. Is this really worth it? What's the end game here? Is it worth my neighbors, my countrymen laying their lives on the line? That's supporting the troops. What's not supporting the troops is whatever administration's in power, you want to start a war? That's patriotic. No, that's stupid. Yeah. You question your government, especially if you call yourself a conservative. That's another example of how far we've come. When Ron Paul said, these anti-war things, especially in 2008, the right in unison, maybe not all the grassroots, but certainly the establishment right called him a liberal. He's on the left. He's a, undercover Democrat or whatever. When Donald Trump in 2016, in my home state of South Carolina, which was Bush country, it 100% was, when Donald Trump on that debate stage told Jeb Bush to his face, your brother lied. There were no WMDs. You lied and you lied. And every talking head from CNN to Fox News is like, Trump is done. This is Bush country. You can't talk like that. Well, Ron Paul had just talked like that 2 cycles prior, maybe got people thinking a little different. And by the time Donald Trump had said something arguably even more forceful than Ron Paul did, and that's saying something, the state completely went for Donald Trump. And that's not no endorsement of Donald Trump, but on that issue, that's something where we're in the right place at the right time and kind of help marshal people's minds towards sort of a more realistic stance on foreign policy.
You know, it is interesting to note kind of how the conservative movement has changed. You know, at Liberty Forum this past week, there was a gentleman there who was there working with another organization that on an issue that we're in total agreement with. But he, interesting thing about him, I don't want to say his name and single him out or anything, but he used to be one of the leaders at Young Americans for Freedom.
Right. This is a very young man we're talking about.
Young Americans for Freedom, which oftentimes when I was at Young Americans for Liberty, we'd often be confused for, but I think occupies a different space within the right. I tend to think these days that Young Americans for Freedom is like the neoconservative youth group, which is why they don't have so many young people these days. Turning Point is the kind of more MAGA Donald Trump student group. Young Americans for Liberty is the Ron Paul movement. But, you know, I remember, of course, in 2012, Ron Paul was on the board for Young Americans for Freedom. And they made a huge spectacle in 2012 of kicking him off and telling him he needs to take his meds. Like, it was so disrespectful. And this guy, I kind of was razzing him for it. And he says, yeah, well, I thought it was the right decision at the time, but over time, I've come to realize that Ron Paul was right about a lot of things,
right,
and we were wrong. And you know, it can, and hey, more power to him. It's hard to admit when you've made, you know, to admit your mistakes like that. But it is a sign, I think, of the neoconservatism on the decline in the Republican Party. And you know, there was a tweet by someone many folks will know, Jeff Deist, who used to be the head of the Mises Institute, is now over at Monetary Metals Exchange. I thought this was a great kind of synopsis of neoconservatism and how it was never really at home in a conservative movement. It's a perversion of conservatism. There's not very much conservative about it. And his tweet was, I'm just going to read this for folks, but it's on the screen for those watching the video version. Neoconservatism is per se left-wing because it is actively interventionist and utopian egalitarian. This applies to domestic and foreign policy equally. Neoconservatives assume both individuals and markets exist to serve the state and its greater purposes, not the other way around. When we talk about the Bush 2 years as a form of red state fascism, this is why. Is there how would you do you think that's an apt description of neoconservatism, or how would you critique that?
That's one, and I agree with everything Jeff said there. Neoconservatism and its mission, which is to spread global democracy at the point of a gun, with the United States holding the gun. I don't even want to call it liberal. It's left wing, in the idea that you can centrally plan and you can spread the culture and political norms and values of a Western Republican democracy like the United States to other cultures that might not have had any such history, and that you can just do that by force and it will work out. I remember Nancy Pelosi during the Obamacare debates. A lot of conservatives will remember she said, we got to pass the bill to see what's in it. Well, the neoconservative worldview is we got to bomb the hell out of the country and see what happens. That's what the Iraq War was. What was the end game there? The end game in Afghanistan was supposedly to rout the Taliban and get the hell out of there. And we were there for 20 years. They could never give us a straight answer for those 2 decades. But that's their goal. And for at least 2000, 2008, that was American conservatism, was that progressive view. Things that conservatives admit big government couldn't do domestically. As far as changing things, you need to get government out of the way. They were all more than ready to believe that big government could accomplish abroad. And we're only now in a place where you were talking about the person associated with Young Americans for Freedom. If you were on the board in 2012 and you thought Ron Paul was the problem, well, you were incorrect. And he admitted that he was part of that. And it sounds like he's now at a place where he thinks Ron Paul was maybe right about a lot of that stuff. I don't know if that's due to Trump saying America first and why are we fighting all these wars and why are we paying for them? And maybe it does, but who said it first? And he was telling you, well, I was thinking about it back then and I was thinking it was wrong. I wrote a piece when YAF kicked Ron Paul off the board in 2012 for the American Conservative, just talking about how the Young Americans for Freedom started in 1960 on the Bill Buckley estate. It's called the Sharon Statement or Sharon Statement. People mispronounce it or pronounce it different ways. And it was like sort of a list of conservative priorities. And I was making the case that the Ron Paul movement was closer to the Sharon Statement of 1960, which founded Young Americans for Freedom, than anything Young Americans for Freedom was doing in 2012 because they were a neoconservative organization. Now, I mentioned that because a gentleman, and I can't think of his name, I hope he's still with us. If he is, he's 105. A gentleman who was there, who was fundamental in crafting the Sharon Statement for the founding of Young Americans for Freedom, wrote a column for the American Conservative saying, yes, what Ron Paul stands for today is far closer to what me as a young conservative stood for when we were founding Young Americans for Freedom in 1960. So that was kind of nice to hear. Neoconservatism is the opposite of what that era in around 1960, the Goldwater era, that was 4 years before he ran, that type of conservatism. And it is, Ron Paul is definitely the opposite of the neoconservatives. The neoconservatives are odd men out. Where are they right now? Well, most of them have gone to the Democratic Party. Bill Kristol's a Democrat now. I think he's pro-choice now. And I'm not trying to get to a debate about abortion, but if you ever think that that issue was important to him, he was pro-life when he was a Republican. Now he's pro-choice because that's more popular in that party. As long as he can start wars, that's what he cares about. He'll flip them on any other issue.
Of course, he was never really pro-life because you can't support the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of people in the Middle East and be pro-life.
That you're singing my tune. He was anti-abortion for a time. He's never been pro-life. Lindsey Graham is not pro-life. He's anti-abortion. He is very much for killing people in Gaza en masse. But what I was going to say is the neoconservative Republicans you have left in the Republican Party, many of them in leadership. Mitch McConnell's that. He won't be around for much longer as Senate leader. Thank God for that. But people like Dan Crenshaw and Lindsey Graham, who just can't understand why we were all Bush Cheney Republicans just 15 years ago, and now these people don't like war and they don't want to give Ukraine money. I don't know how stupid they are, but it's because we're in a different place, and Ron Paul set the stage. I would say his son, Senator Rand Paul, and his popularity through those Tea Party years pre-Trump helped keep those sentiments alive, along with a number of others. And when Trump arrived and said some of the things we like on foreign policy, and he was not perfect in that as president, he had many mistakes, but it made the Republican Party and the conservative base think about that issue and some other things in a completely radically different way. And that's a win.
Now, talking about kind of the Republican Party, kind of the old guard falling away and kind of a new trajectory that the Republican Party is going on. Certainly part of that is going to be defined by Trumpism. I mean, he's a force with some staying power, at least for now. But that also, there are some other possibilities of kind of other wings of the party kind of continuing to grow and have more of a place. Now, it's interesting that you bring up Mitch McConnell, who, of course, has announced that he is not going to be running again for Senate Majority Leader. And I know, I guess minority leader, right? He's not going to be the leader of the Republican caucus in the Senate going forward. And of course, there's tons of speculation about who might succeed him. And I'll admit, when I first heard this, and I was sitting in the Judiciary Committee in the Maine legislature, and Democrats are saying, who do you think it's going to be? And I just figured it's probably not going to be anyone better. It's probably going to be just one of these other establishment hacks like John Cornyn from Texas, or one of these folks. It's going to be like a face changes, but nothing changes.
Right.
But, there's been a lot of speculation, surprisingly so, about Rand Paul serving as the leader of the Republican caucus. Now, personally, I mean, I'd love to see it. I'm skeptical that it would ever happen because he just is not the kind of person who politicians elect to lead them. But, Rand very well. You co-authored his book and you worked in his office for a time. What do you make of the speculation about Rand Paul as the leader? And of course, Rand Paul's playing into it himself. He's been doing polls on social media and sending emails asking for feedback on it. What do you make of this speculation of Rand Paul as a potential leader for the Republican caucus?
It's positive, but I would put your question like this. in the era we're living in 2024, after the Ron Paul movement, those campaigns, after Trump was elected, after Rand Paul's been a senator for well over a decade now, is it more likely Rand Paul could be the Senate minority leader or one day Senate majority leader now than it was 15 years ago? I think the answer is it would be more likely now than it ever would have been 15 years ago. And that's the place we're in. When Donald Trump ran for president, people are like, he can't. That's not how this works. The dude like that can't be president. Well, he did. So I think you can see people elected to certain positions, certain elected period, people who you wouldn't have thought would have never had a chance in a different time. We need disruptors. My favorite candidates for president in no particular order are Trump, who, whatever you think of him as a disruptor, RFK Jr., who I don't think is very good on the Israel-Gaza stuff, but he's good on a lot of stuff, Cornel West, who's running as a far-left green guy, Marianne Williamson has some qualities. What all those people have in common is not their policies, they're disruptors. They're people running for president who should never be able to get there. Bernie Sanders early on, not anymore, was a disruptor. When Hillary was burying him in the 2016 Democratic primary, he was a disruptor. And I was encouraged by that. Not that I want a socialist to be in charge, but that the establishment in both parties and political elites in general know that they don't have that kind of power anymore. In fact, in 2012, when Young Americans for Freedom were kicking Ron Paul off the board, what that was is they saw the popularity of him at that CPAC. He won the straw poll, as he did many years.
Right. It was right after he won that straw poll.
Exactly. It's right after he won, they made the announcement it was a stunt. But the message there, and they specifically said this guy's against the wars, he's a peacenik, however they put it, pure Bush Cheney language. They were trying to hold on. They were like, we are the conservative youth organization, meaning neoconservative at the time. They were still straggling, even 4 years after Bush had no longer been in office. They were making a statement. This Ron Paul garbage that's so popular at CPAC, be gone. That is not what conservatism is. It is Bush. It is Cheney. And they far lost that. I think the average YAF member, to the degree that you can find one anymore, probably doesn't think like that anymore. To the degree that they do, it's not as diehard. It is far more gone in the direction of, I would say, libertarian foreign policy. You could call it populist if you wanted to. I'm a libertarian populist myself. I think Javier Milei is the greatest libertarian populist, most successful in the world right now. We're just in a different world. So is Rand Paul going to be the head of Republicans in the Senate? I would love to see it as much as you would, and probably everybody watching or listening. There's more of a chance today than there was in the past.
Yeah. And that's a great way of looking at it. I mean, I think that oftentimes kind of in the liberty movement, I think I certainly get criticized for it at times for, saying something positive about a political figure who is who's not a libertarian, right? I've said some nice things about Donald Trump. There's much I criticize about Donald Trump as well. Certainly, he's not a libertarian. He's not the avatar of our ideas or our ideology. But there is some value in when you have a very cemented, corrupt establishment to just have a wrecking ball that just comes in and just smashes things. And for whatever, I don't necessarily believe in whatever vision he has. I don't know that he has a coherent vision on what he wants to replace it with, right? But I mean, and I think oftentimes I get criticized by younger libertarians who don't remember the Bush era, don't remember just how terrible the neoconservatives were, and they grew up under Trump, and they know Trump's not a libertarian, and he's certainly not, and there's plenty to criticize him on, but the change that has happened that he's helped do with changing the ideology of the Republican base on war, even if in some ways he's made the base better than he is on war.
So go ahead, Breaky. I'm sorry.
No, that there is value in that. And as someone who's been fighting to try to make the Republican Party better and trying to displace the neoconservatives for the last 10 years, it gives me some hope and encouragement. And Donald Trump will not be there forever. I'm not convinced that his political movement can hold on without him. It's so personality driven. But it does create an opportunity when he finally steps aside. There will be a vacuum, and I think that there's an opportunity. If we continue institution building within the liberty movement, within the Republican Party or otherwise, I think there is opportunity there when this Trump moment passes for the liberty movement to really take a prominent place within the Republican Party.
That's right. It's going to be a mad scramble. I remember one of the funniest things in recent years. And when I say a mad scramble, I think once Trump, the man, is no longer on the scene, I have big questions about whether that movement can be held. It is a personality-driven movement, as are many. Ron Paul was, Bernie Sanders is. I mean, like, that's not unusual. It's human nature. It's nothing to be ashamed of or be down on. But I think you'll see sort of the national conservatives, sort of your J.D. Vance and Josh Hawley, and those people sort of make a play for this is what MAGA is. I think the libertarians have just as much power to do the same thing, with Rand Paul leading the charge. If Justin Amash can get to the Senate, obviously there's Thomas Massey, Mike Lee, I would consider part of that conversation. Some people like Dan Bishop and Chip Roy in the House. I mean, there's a lot of people who are good on a lot of our issues that could make that case. And the neoconservatives are going to try to say, well, we're MAGA. I know that sounds silly. What I was going to mention earlier, John Bolton, neocon's neocon, appeared at one of those goofy national conservative conferences they've been holding the last couple of years. His speech was that he was America first. And people, the NatCons, if nothing else, are pretty good on foreign policy, and the big New Deal morons after that. But John Bolton's case for being America first was, when there's a problem in Syria, America needs to be there first. When there's a problem in Ukraine and Russia, America needs to be there first. And even those people are like, man, come on, like, we're not that stupid. But he's right.
America's going to be first in the order of the global world empire they want us to live under.
But he's right to try. Look, Bill Kristol is a mastermind of this stuff. And God, I'm dating myself here. When George H.W. Bush was picking a vice president, and he wanted some neoconservative influence in there, more than had been in the Reagan administration, where there was a lot less than people actually realize if you go back and look at the history. He handpicked his boss, or helped pick his boss, Dan Quayle, who was a little bit more of a hawk, and he wanted that in and around the White House. Bill Kristol's the person who suggested Sarah Palin for John McCain's 2008. Now, she wasn't a hawk, but they immediately hired hawk advisors to put around her and tell her how to think about foreign policy, and have her with John McCain, who was already a hawk. Tom Cotton, who's an uber hawk, thought about running for office in part because of his friendship with Bill Kristol. They would communicate. But Kristol saw the value in having these leaders out there that were going to verbalize his neoconservative, very aggressive pro-war sentiments. There's a value in that. So when Trump says something, even if you don't like everything about him and it's the thing that you agree with, you use it and you promote it. That's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with that. You want to have people in positions of power and influence who can do the things that you like. And you should. That's politics. There's nothing shameful about that. So the neocons have been smart about that for a very long time. And they've also been merciless. They were the first to say, if you don't agree with what I agree with, you're not a conservative. Libertarians need to do the same. I know we're running out of time, but one point I wanted to make, you mentioned earlier, Eric, and it's related to what I just said. You said you'll talk to younger libertarians who really only knew Trump and grew up in the Trump era, and that's all they know, and they really didn't understand how restrictive and bad it was under Bush Cheney and just that era of republicanism. I would say to those young people this: you're not young enough that you don't remember what Nikki Haley just did in the Republican primary, where Joe Biden is saying, Israel, you can have as much money as you want to do what you want, no strings attached, and we're going to keep sending money to Ukraine, and Ukraine's going to win, even though it's really the U.S. prolonging our proxy war with Russia. And then you had Nikki Haley saying, the problem with Joe Biden is he's not sending enough money to Ukraine, and enough people aren't dying, and this war is not bigger, and he's not giving enough money to Israel too, and more people in Gaza need to die. Now, she didn't phrase it that way, but that's basically what she was saying. That Nikki Haley approach used to work every time. Republicans would be like, yeah, we ain't a pansy like that Biden. We got to get some more killing and spending going on. That was the Bush Cheney era. That doesn't work anymore. Her campaign went nowhere. The grassroots laughed at her. Why the hell is she still there? I don't agree with anything she's saying. That used to work. That was the Republican Party. So that's how far we've come. That's how I put it.
And a closing thought, because I enjoyed talking with you so much, Jack. Well, we are running up on the clock here, but just like there has been, and you've written about this extensively, the fight over the legacy of Ronald Reagan, right? Mm-hmm. Neoconservatives fought to redefine Reagan's legacy and to make him out to be some uber hawk who is ready to go into every war and fight every war. When you would point out, actually, Ronald Reagan pulled out of Middle Eastern conflicts when things got too crazy and he realized there wasn't an American interest there. Actually, he went over and he spoke with the Russians, and for all of his, tough talk against the evil empire, he still he spoke with the Russians and he avoided a nuclear disaster. Well, but he certainly has a mixed legacy. There's things you can point to on either side.
Sure.
Well, and Trump is similar, right? There are, you could talk about how Trump fueled the war in Yemen, right? And and dropped bombs on wars that were already going on. But the fact that part of his legacy that people remember is that he didn't start any new wars. I mean, if that's what the Republican Party base's takeaway is of Donald Trump, and that comes to define his legacy going forward, so that when people say, I'm a real conservative, I'm like Donald Trump, I'm against war, that's a great thing, right? That's something that we should embrace and celebrate. Not to say, and obviously it is not a complete picture, but if we want to stop war, we do need to fight for control of these narratives. And I'm going to give you the last word, and then we gotta go.
I'm looking at the clock, and I know when to shut my mouth, but let me see if I can get it all in. I was talking about Bill Kristol earlier. Bill Kristol in 1996 was the head of something called the Project for a New American Century, and the big essay they wrote was called Toward a Reaganite Foreign Policy, which was saying that neoconservatism, he was making the pitch to invade Iraq that early, but Bill Clinton didn't go for it. What he was saying is neoconservatism was what Reagan was. And the reason he did that is Reagan was the most popular figure in the Republican Party, and he knew capitalizing on him meant getting his vision of what foreign policy should be used more. So Reagan, in actuality, as you just said, when there was the bombing in Lebanon, in Beirut, he immediately withdrew the troops. He said, there's no interest there. Why are they still there? That's not what neoconservatives do. His greatest legacy, though, was talking to Gorbachev because he was so scared of nuclear war, he had nightmares about it at night. And the Republican right, people like Newt Gingrich back then, said he was a pansy. He was Neville Chamberlain. This is Munich. You're talking to our enemies. You're a sellout. You're selling out the country. And behold, Reagan's greatest legacy was talking to our enemies and preventing nuclear war. Look right now and by the way, Ron Paul would always say in a debate, well, what would you do, Ron Paul, Mr. Anti-War? He's like, I would have diplomacy. I'd have talks. That's what you do instead of war. Donald Trump, when he was asked about Ukraine, Biden's like, oh, we're going to support them till the end. This war will go on and blah, 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 blah. And Nikki Haley was like, he's not doing enough. We need more war. Trump said, I'm going to go talk to Putin. And most people like Trump in the Republican Party are like, well, man, maybe that's the conservative thing to do. That's what Ron Paul said, too. They might not remember that, but he said basically the same thing. And that's what Reagan did. So to the degree that we could be smart marshals of our own ideology and smart libertarians, use the example of Reagan. It doesn't matter as much now. Certainly use Trump, who matters a lot now, and always remind people that Ron Paul was right throughout.
Absolutely. All right, Jack, that's got to be the last word. Thank you so much. But real quick, where can people find you if they want to follow you and follow your work?
On Twitter, now X, I'm Jack Hunter 74. That's the same handle on Instagram and Facebook, and I believe TikTok.
All right. Awesome. Jack, thank you so much for being with us.
Good to be with you, Eric. Always good to talk to you.
100%. All right, everyone. Real quick for our second promotion spot of the show. Actually, I don't have anything to promote because usually I'm promoting two different events, but Liberty Forum just ended. I told you about Pork Fest at the start of the episode. If you are someone who you love liberty and you've got something you'd like to promote to our audience, shoot me an email, breaky@fsp.org. And if you got something I feel is a high quality product or something our audience would be interested in, you'd like to sponsor the show, maybe we can work something out and your ad could be right here. I could be reading a script saying how great it is, whatever it is you got. So that all those funds will go directly towards supporting the Free State Project and our mission. All right. Looking at the end of the clock here, we're going to wrap up. I want to say thank you to our technical producer, Justin O'Donnell, for running everything behind the scenes. And furthermore, my opinion is the Federal Reserve should be destroyed.